So, since I had basic enemies and crude combat in place after the last video, naturally I moved on to work on something else, right? I went off to look at the tracking mechanics, maybe the island generation, anything instead of continuing with the combat and adding other unnecessary mechanics, right? God damn it. And we're back. Apologies for the delay on this one. October has been a pretty hectic month for me, so up until the last week or so I hadn't really had much time to work on the game. Anyway, like I said, I wanted to start implementing other base forms of mechanics, but I just couldn't shake the fact that I wasn't happy with combat. The game's about fighting monsters, so it bugged me to no end that I still couldn't really fight the monsters. I had ideas for a lot of different systems that I wanted to make, and to be honest, I was procrastinating. But no more. I put my head down and set my sights on getting combat feeling nice, or at least starting to. And I think it's finally kind of coming together a little bit. There's a lot of little things in this, so I'm just gonna fire through this one. So before I could do pretty much anything else in the game, I thought it would be a good idea to start implementing some player stats. Now, I'm sure there's literally thousands of different ways that you could do this, and I'm sure there's better ways of doing it than the way that I'm doing it, but the approach that I've gone for is having essentially a main player stats class that handles the getting and setting of specific stats like health, stamina, speed, things like that, as well as the costs for specific actions like sprinting, rolling, and jumping. That way, if the player gets a modifier or levels up a skill or something, that class just handles the base values that inform everything else. This acts kind of like the brain. Then what I can do is write separate stat system classes that handle the logic and implementation of those stats. So for instance, in my player stats manager, I have values for stamina, and then I created a separate system for stamina management, which draws costs and default values from the main player stats class. This means that the main stats class doesn't get overly clogged with logic and implementation, and I can have the logic for altering each stat separated out to make debugging easier. And also I can easily disable or enable different classes for testing, like removing sprinting and things like that. Since I wanted to flesh out combat, I wanted to first implement a working stamina system, hence the stats. This was pretty straightforward, especially since I already had a stat system and, the player controller, and because I followed a tutorial and then tweaked it slightly to suit my needs. And soon I had a rechargeable stamina system for sprinting, rolling, but not attacking yet. I'll get to that at some point. The basic gist is you slap in a UI element, horizontal fill that bad boy, and set the fill amount to be the percentage of stamina remaining. And before you could say, "Dear God, why am I out of stamina? Please help me," you've got a working stamina system. So, reworks. One of the big things that was frustrating to me about combat was the targeting. I had a system in place that worked, but it didn't really feel great for the kind of game I'm trying to make. The way it worked is you had a list of possible targets, and that gets updated as you get closer or further away from different targetable objects. Then when you were close to something that you could target, you'd be given a UI prompt for targeting, and then you could sort of lock onto that one specific thing. Which is fine, that's pretty much how Tunic works, I think. But it just felt a little bit restrictive. One thing I wanted is to ultimately have fast-paced combat with multiple enemies spawning from different directions, coming at the player has to think on their feet, retarget and everything, and that style of targeting just didn't really work for that. You've got to look at target cycling and it's the whole thing. Also, it was surprisingly hard to implement. There was this weird bug where it would just kill everything in range at once instead of the thing you were targeting. Programming is hard. So I looked at other styles of isometric games that I enjoy and took a page from the book of Project Zomboid. Now, if you haven't played Project Zomboid, it's a really good zombie survival game. You should check it out. Now, I feel like Zomboid is a bit of a funny reference for melee combat because it's not really famous for that, but I really like their targeting system and the way it handles. It's a free-form 360-degree system where you effectively enter a targeting mode and then use the mouse to control the player direction. This was actually way easier to implement. I just needed to cast a ray from the camera, use the world mouse position as the current target for the player, then took the same UI element that I was using before for specific target objects, turn it on its side, and use it for the mouse position on the ground. I even kept the same radial animation for when you're entering and exiting targeting mode, and I think it looks pretty good. Currently you target by holding right mouse, and it feels 1,000 times better. I also made it that the player can't sprint in this mode, but instead they roll, so the sort of dynamics change depending on whether you're targeting or not. One day I'll fix that roll animation. One day.
But it is not this day.
One thing that I've been asked a few times is how does the random generation of the creatures affect the creature itself apart from aesthetics? How does it affect the gameplay? Am I just gonna generate a random shape and then assign arbitrary abilities anyway? No. The idea is that the behaviors and abilities of the monsters are directly informed by what parts make up that monster, what the building blocks are. Each component that makes up the monster affects its stats, right? It affects its size, its speed, its strength, the effect on the area around it, the way that it interacts with the player, and the way, in turn, that the player can interact with it. One thing that will be the foundation for this is targeted damage during combat. So dealing and being dealt damage to specific parts of the body. Aside from the fact that I think it's cool and could lead to some permanent injuries for the player, like losing an arm or something, I think it also ties in the entire vibe that I'm going for with the monster hunting, strategy and preparation. Like I said, if you just run in swinging, you'll probably die. But if you do your homework, study the monster, the player can learn specific strategies for defeating them. They can learn about weak points to target, limbs that might be severed strategically or trapped in order to turn the tide. I want the combat to be just as thoughtful as the preparation. Like one big old dangerous bloody game of chess. It also ties in nicely with the modular monsters idea in general. If monsters are made up of generated parts, I want those parts to affect the combat individually, and have the player be able to interact with those parts in different ways. So instead of giving the monsters a health bar and having players just whack away at it, the monster's health is made up of the health of the individual parts, and not evenly. Some parts might contribute more to the health of the enemy than others. To lay the foundations for this, I wrote a modular system that can be attached to any part of the monster, and can then be configured to determine the specific attributes of that body part. This can be added dynamically, or as part of a pre-configured limb prefab. You set the type of body part. This is important because I don't just want things to be hittable, but also trappable, or climbable, or things like that. This system defines how the player can interact with different parts of the monster. For now though, it is mainly configured to dealing damage, but the idea is that it's easily expandable. Then you can set the health of the body part, configure any kind of custom animation that comes from interacting with it, set if it can be destroyed and if it deals damage as it goes, like some sort of central body part, or whether it deals a percentage of the monster's health at the end when it's destroyed, like a weak spot. Then you can specify which visual parts are disabled when this particular body part is destroyed, and which spawn, say if a leg gets cut off, it'll disable the leg and then spawn a new leg in the air. It also applies a random force on the newly spawned object, so it just kind of flies off a bit, which is always satisfying. And so for an example, if I set it up to make the head a weak point, set the health to the current damage that the sword does in one swing, which is 10, and also make it deal 100% damage to the rest of the monster, and set it to spawn a new head on hit. This is how it looks. And it's super fast to iterate also. I don't have enemy stats implemented yet outside of health, but if I make a similar system to the player, then those stats could be directly editable by the player damaging parts of the monster, as well as enabling or disabling certain abilities, like severing a leg to slow a creature down, severing an arm to stop a certain attack, tying a rope around a part of the monster to keep it tied to a tree if it keeps trying to fly away or something. And it has the potential to be very versatile, and it makes me excited to work on it more and expand it. So aside from adding stuff in, like the player stats, stamina, modular combat, there was also a bunch of things I wanted to clean up. Firstly, I fixed the nav mesh. I 100% misunderstood how the new nav mesh system worked and thought that each object needed to have a nav mesh surface component, which is kind of funny. The result was effectively a new nav mesh being baked for every object, which understandably freaked out the nav mesh agents, which is why all the monsters in the last video were acting really weirdly. For anyone else who's struggling with this, the idea is you have an empty object in the scene with a surface component for each kind of nav mesh. And in that, you specify the kinds of objects that contribute to the nav mesh, then when you bake it, it'll look through the scene and use those objects automatically. I also fixed up some monster issues where the IK wasn't scaling properly with the monster's size, so bigger monsters would have their feet all together and were walking weirdly, and smaller monsters would be like doing the splits. The fix was just to multiply the step distance and foot spacing by the scale of the monster. I've also added an IK rig to the players and monsters' arms for attacking, but we'll talk about that next time. I will say the hardest part of this entire thing was getting the monster's body to go limp when you kill it. Like, it sounds simple. I looked into doing a sort of ragdoll setup, but as far as I'm aware, you can't really make that at runtime on a generated mesh. So essentially what I did is just kill all the AI scripts that are running and then add gravity to a rigid body on the main object itself. But the issue was then that it was falling through the ground because the main parent object doesn't have a solid collider. And I can't make one beforehand because I don't know how big the monster's gonna be because it hasn't been generated yet. So basically I had to write a script that creates a new collider based on the size of the body parts of the monster so it doesn't fall through the ground. Also, I had to increase the step distance for the feet so that the IK would still bend when the body falls, but the legs wouldn't keep trying to reposition itself. There was some interesting results trying to get the IK to still play along after death. Oh yes, I wanted to start highlighting some of the features that I include when I'm procrastinating. These are often just fun to make, but are totally unnecessary. For this month I added a bullet time zoom in for things like severing monsters' limbs. Essentially you just feed it a target and a duration and it'll use coroutines to lerp the time scale of the game. Coroutines are good for that sort of thing because they can use unscaled time to kind of sit outside of everything else that's happening. I already had a camera zoom and rotate system for looking at the player when you're getting in and out of the ship and things like that. So I just changed the target to the newly severed limb piece and voila, instant bullet time. I also added a quick little function for scaling the pitch of all audio sources by the timescale, but I don't have that much audio playing, so it doesn't really work much. So moving forward, I want to start implementing some of the other gameplay features, like I said I would, like a special focus system that the player can use during combat, but also in other parts of the world, like looking for clues or tracking monsters. I think focus is going to be a really interesting point to touch on next time. There's also still a lot more that I want to do with combat though, so we'll see. This is feeling better, but it's nowhere near done. Anyway, even though this one was delayed, there will still be a November video, hopefully around November 15th. Yeah, either way, drop your thoughts below and I'll see you in the next one. Sweet coffee eases the pain.